outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Sunday Social with Teachers Talk Radio. Now, today I have Daniel Deacon here, and we're going to be talking about life beyond the ELT classroom, publishing, working and living in South Korea, and some other things like that. But if you have any particular questions, feel free to comment, and we'll see if we can get around to some of the questions. Now, something that I normally do at the beginning of the live stream, Dan, is to read out a bio, which guests tend to send me, and I've printed out your bio here.
Right.
And so let's welcome Dan. Dan has worked in ELT since 2004, teaching at 2 universities in South Korea, and in the UK and Czechia. Czechia, is that right?
Czechia, I think it is, yeah.
Czechia.
The former Czech Republic.
Oh, right, okay. And he's working in the ELT publishing industry. He's worked in ELT publishing in Korea and the UK since 2012 as a materials writer, editor, project manager, and now a publisher at 2 renowned ELT publishing companies. He's now set to embark on a new chapter of providing project management, consulting services to ELT and book publishing professionals. So hopefully I've dotted my I's and crossed the T's there.
That's absolutely right, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, welcome. Thank you ever so much for joining. And perhaps if we could get started, maybe at the beginning of your career, you mentioned you've been teaching in Korea, and myself being resident now in Korea. Mm-hmm. Could you tell me what kind of led you into teaching and how you got into Korea in the end?
Yes, I think it's that kind of age-old story that I sort of fell into it more than planned to go off and do that. My elder sister actually was teaching in Korea. She went there about 2000. The year left, went back in 2002 for a couple of years. I graduated from university in 2002, and I wasn't really sure what I particularly wanted to do, but I think it was 2004. My sister said, well, look, I've got a bit of time off. It's Chuseok. I'm between jobs. Come and visit. And I had just done a TEFL certificate a couple of months before that, one of those weekend courses, because I thought, well, if she's doing that, maybe I can do that somewhere, but France or Spain or something like that. Mm-hmm. So luckily it all worked out, and I had the time and the money, and I went off to visit Korea for 10 days and in Seoul, and really enjoyed it. And I thought, well, I can do that. I've got the certificate. I can do that. Mm-hmm. So I just thought I'll go and do that for a year. Wasn't sure what I was going to do after graduation. And I got a job teaching kindergarten down in the south of Seoul. And I don't know, I think something just clicked in me after a couple of months. Something just clicked where I thought, I can do this. I can do this really well. And I'm enjoying it. And I enjoy having to learn about what I need to do in the classroom, and then getting the validation of seeing it work when I'm working with the students. And so I stayed another year, stayed a third year, and then I decided to leave, went back to Europe for a couple of years, and then came back to Korea for the university jobs. So it was sort of, just falling into it, but then realizing that I could do it, and it clicked, and I was doing it well.
That's great, yeah. My experience is pretty much quite the same, although I was in Korea back in 2005. That's when I first arrived here. Yeah, and I ended up in a small Hagwan, like a private language institute in Ansong, and I had a small weekend TEFL certificate and ended up getting a job there and started working, really enjoyed it. And then after about 14 months, I then pursued a CELTA, and that was it. Yeah. And then based on your profile, you mentioned you worked at a university or 2 universities in Korea. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I did 3 years in the Hagwan, as I said, and then I went to Europe for 2 years, and that's when I spent 6 months in what we used to call Czech Republic. We now call it Czechia, and then 18 months or so in the UK. And then I thought I kind of wanted to go back to Korea, but I wanted to stretch myself. So I looked for a university job. Mercifully, I managed to get one. What I'd done in between in Czechia was working with adults, and then also in the UK, I'd worked for one of those kind of summer language camps where come over from all over Europe, even further afield sometimes, and they do a couple of weeks. They have English lessons and other things. I then developed the course for that particular school. They had a bunch of old lesson plans, but they wanted a syllabus putting together. So I sort of worked on that and trained a little bit more. And and then I thought, I'm going to try my luck, and I tried a university job in Korea, and I did manage to get that job. That was just outside of Seoul, but they also ran a master's program. So while I was teaching, I did my first semester, and then the second semester I started doing a part-time master's there in TESOL. So I spent 2 years doing that, 4 semesters doing that. So similar thing, a bit more training and really learning through very academic theory in the master's, what you do to teach and how you do things and how you run things, and then seeing it happen in the classroom once you start to apply that.
Yes,
really fascinating and that's probably a theme of later when we talk about publishing, of learning things, trying them, and then seeing them work. It's very validating.
It is. Yeah. You get that sort of confirmation, don't you? Like, or confirmation that either works or it doesn't, and then you adjust it. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think at a university where you tend to teach, you would tend to have the same course that you're teaching maybe 3 or 4 times a week. My first university, I used to teach 2 or 3 different textbooks, but I would have, say, 4 classes a week of reading. You've got that chance to kind of plan the lesson and see how it's going to go, test it out, and then the next time you do it, you can go back and tweak it. By the time the 3rd or 4th class gets it, they've got like the absolute best version, because you've made a mistake in the first or second version of the lesson, and and they get a really good one. They get the best version of the lesson you can make it.
I always feel a sense of sorrow for my first students that are undertaking a new course or something like that that I've had to develop, because they're getting the sort of the unpolished version of a course in a way. Whereas, multiple times, once you've taught it over a few semesters, you can really tinker with it and improve it.
Absolutely, and you get sort of good feedback from the students as well. You get to know whether it works for them, and you see the results and the successes and whether that works. In my second university, I then taught only the 1 textbook, but it was 4 classes a week, and I would do sort of 2 classes on a Thursday, 2 classes on the Friday. So I used to say that very thing jokingly to the first classes. You've got the raw end of the deal, because you're getting the one where this is the kind of testing of it, and then the next class would get the one that if one activity you think, oh, that works really well, but in 2 classes it failed on Thursday afternoon. So Friday morning before the next class, I would be tinkering with the lesson and fixing it, and then it would work quite well with the second 2 groups.
Yeah. Now, in terms of teaching in Korea, what sort of advice would you give for someone who's new in the English language teaching industry?
I have to go back a little bit, because I haven't taught for 6 or 7 years now. But, I remember when I was teaching in Korea, you'd get people that really found it difficult or didn't really sort of enjoy it very much, and other people that really embraced it and kind of let some of the difficulties kind of wash over them in some ways. It depends what kind of person perhaps you are. I think you have to accept that you're going from a culture like your own, and particularly the English language speaking cultures like Canada and America and Britain, South Africa, Australia, are all very similar cultures, similar outlooks, but you're going to a place where it could completely be the opposite. And I think you have to kind of forget that, not be ethnocentric and expect it to revolve around you, but embrace and understand the differences. I think that's one thing that applies not only to the culture side of things, but also to the teaching side of things. The vast majority of teaching courses in Korea are probably the Hagwans, the private language schools or the cram schools. And those students are not necessarily there because they want to be there. They're there because parents have pushed them to it. And then the schools want the kids to be happy because they want the money to keep rolling in. So in some ways, it's not about the teaching in some ways. So a lot of people really want to put that in to things. But I think as long as you recognize that, you can obviously be so passionate about your teaching and do the best that you want to do, but don't let the other side of it frustrate you. Similar to universities, I mean, a lot of university English courses could potentially be ones where the students are not majors. They're not choosing this course. It's a required course for them. That's one thing I found, that a lot of students were kind of like, so what? I turn up, that's my participation. I pass the course, I get my grade, and, I graduate and that sort of thing. So you can still really work with those students, though. Don't knock your confidence or anything like that. But also, I think you've got to also understand the Korean culture. The students, particularly across East Asia, often have an expectation that the teacher is going to run a class, and as a student, you're sitting there to absorb what the teacher is going to tell you. So it can often feel like the students are not really participating. They're not listening, maybe. They're not following. But it's just that the way that they're being taught all through their high school is to absorb what a teacher is telling you, and they're not used to the more communicative way, or at least that was my experience.
It kind of echoes some of the experiences that I've had in Korea. And one thing that I learned early on, particularly in the Hagwan, that was a real eye-opener, was to how the Hagwan was run. It was very different to how my experience was in the UK at like a summer school or later on in my career. And I can sympathize with the directors having to appease the parents because they're the ones that are in control of what's being taught to some regard, what to cover. And I think it was my wife who mentioned to me, with her being from Korea, was that when she was studying, parents and students to some regard don't necessarily have that ability to learn, but they just want the answer. Just tell me the answer, particularly with these sort of national university university entrance exams, the Sunung, where it's like, you can forget about what I think, but just tell me the answer so I can get the correct mark. And then,
to memorize the answer, regurgitate the answer. It's kind of, we always say often, don't we? It's not the destination, it's the journey. It's maybe the other way around. It's the destination. It's the journey. It's the destination for them, and not the journey part of it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if we move on then, so obviously working in a Hagwan is going to be very different to Korea, although there's certain societal issues and that side of things which are very similar. But in terms of university, what would be the requirements to enter a university, to work at a university in South Korea, from your experience?
Yeah, well, when I was, my first university job was 2010 and my second one was 2013. So at that time, when I was getting into my second university job, it was starting to become required that people would have a master's, have an MA in TESOL. I believe it's still the same. I haven't actually researched it in the last 2 or 3 years, but I believe it was the same. It became a Ministry of Education requirement, I think. And that's why I saw it as being important. I had the opportunity at my first university to take a master's on. I did get a little bit of a scholarship as well from taking it with them. And then there were some requirements starting to creep into job ads where they wanted people with PhDs as well. I don't know if that ever became the requirement, but they often said,
I think the requirement now is, yes, an MA and some certificates such as the CELTA or Trinity TESOL.
Something like you had to have 2 years of equivalent university experience, whether that was at a university in Korea, a university in another country, or something that would be of a similar level. But I think it had to be ratified or recognised. By the government.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what the sort of hurdles I had to go through when I was applying for a job at university in South Korea, because I only came back to work in South Korea in August 2023.
Right. Okay.
So having to go through the hurdles of, and fortunately for me, I'd been teaching at a university in the UK for, I think it was around 4 years in total.
Right.
But because of GDPR and data protection, it was very difficult to provide what the Korean authorities wanted in terms of a sort of a certificate of work or employment to say he's been working and that sort of thing.
I remember getting issued with those, and it's not really a thing in other countries, I don't think, is it?
No,
it's a certificate that you did work here or you are working
here. Yeah. Where it's very common in Korea, where you can just get a certificate of employment, and then
I've still
you
got
can.
mine, yeah.
You've got
my box of things from Korea. I've still got that.
You can get it framed, I suppose.
Yeah.
And yeah, so you can, and then there's the MA and 2 years work university experience, or a PhD with no university employment.
Okay, right.
I think that's what the rules are now. So it's very different to how it was, I suppose, in the early 2000s, where it was like, okay, you're an English speaker, you've got a BA, okay, you can work at the university.
Yeah, you come.
But
I think also wasn't there? Oh no, there was something I was going to say then, and I forgot it. But there was something else they wanted that you would need for that, and I've forgotten what it is now. So.
Okay. Perhaps a criminal background check and.
Oh yes, that was it. I was going to say
about,
I was going to say about some of the paperwork. If you're going into teaching in the younger schools, there's a lot more hurdles. You need a lot more paperwork, a lot more criminal background checks and things like that, because you're teaching with children, whereas in the university system you're deemed to be working with adults. So there's fewer responsibilities and requirements, and you get a different visa. I used to get an E1 rather than an E2.
Yes,
that was a lot less paperwork to do, a lot less notarization. So there was a lot less of a headache to get into a university that way.
That's true. So in terms of that, it's a notarization of your degree certificates and apostilled, and then apostille of your criminal background check, which all adds up and takes time.
Yeah, but it's a lot of a headache, isn't it? I do remember when they brought all of that in. I think about 20 years ago, I think a recruiter was busted for bringing people in with fake degrees, I think from Canada or something like that, and the recruiter gave all the names of the teachers, and about 200 teachers were part of it, and then after that they brought these stricter checks in.
Yeah, I think that's very good, because it professionalizes the whole industry, particularly where there was less regulation in a particular country, so it's a lot more professional, recognized, I guess. And
Structured, perhaps, or kind of separating wheat from the chaff, isn't it?
Yes, it does. Right. I'm just going to go into today's sponsor. So today, this show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational. They're publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. So level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their range of titles. And you can use the following code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your next order. Right. Well, I think it's time that we move on from, Korea and that side of things. And you returned back to the UK, and you are now working within the publishing industry. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I came back to the UK in late summer of 2018. So I left Korea right at the very, very beginning of 2018, and I took that opportunity to take some time off to go and travel. And I thought at that point, here's a chance. I may never get it again. So I kind of traveled across 26 countries to get back home, and then I thought teaching was over. So I thought that what I really wanted to do after teaching was to be working in publishing in some ways, because I had started in Korea in about 2012, starting to work with publishers and starting to do editorial things. And kind of, again, like I said earlier, that kind of, I felt something unlocked in me when I started to do that. And I thought this was kind of my exit plan, as it were, because I wasn't sure, having taught at a university in Korea, the equivalence, I didn't know whether that would work back in the UK at a university, or whether I really wanted to do that still anymore. But I did find over 4 or 5 years of publishing that was something I felt I could do. So that's what I started to target my efforts on. Initially working freelance, but I ended up, in looking for freelance work, I ended up applying for a job at a publishing house in Oxford, and was offered an interview, and I took it, a couple of interviews, and I was offered the job. So I thought, great, a chance to kind of start in a new industry and get some experience. Because I think I came back in August. I think this was sort of November time, and it wasn't going quite so well as I thought. So there was also an opportunity to go and teach in Italy, and I really had to think, do I want to be in the UK in January where it's cold and dark and raining all the time, or do I want to be in Italy where I'm teaching? It's less money. It's what I can do anyway. There's a slight chance of perhaps training up to be a DOS, a director of studies, and then it's piazzas and beautiful places and things like that, or do this. And I thought, no, be sensible. Let's take the path where you're going to learn a lot more. So I chose that instead. So yeah, and ever since then I've been working full time in publishing.
That's great.
Side.
Yeah, and for those, you mentioned, you started with materials development or within the ELT publishing sphere. What would you recommend for those teachers who are keen to broaden their horizons and try things outside of the classroom? What advice would you have?
Yeah, well, there's quite a bit I could say about it. I'll try and keep it structured, but I think that it's very competitive. That's first of all, but there's a lot of opportunities. So I think if that's something that you want to do, then absolutely go for it. But I think that it isn't going to happen overnight. I think there's a bit of work, a bit of groundwork to be done first of all, and then once you cover the groundwork, then you can. I think it gets a lot easier, and you can start to do that. It would really depend on whether you want to drop teaching and do that full time, or whether you want to do both together. I think there's arguments for and against both ways of doing it. Well, not for and against both ways of doing it, but there are different kind of tracks you can go down. Both, and hopefully I can sort of give a bit more advice a little bit later on those different ways. But for anybody that wants to get into materials writing, I think you really one thing you've got to start to do probably is understand the publishing landscape and understand the publishing industry, if it's the ELT publishing industry you want to be working in, because there's different types of industries in different parts of the world. There's a handful of sort of big publishers that I can't remember how many there are, 6 or 7 of them, that the big global players, but they target different parts of the world, and one of them will be dominant in another. One of them will be a bigger player in one market, but not in another.
Yes, yeah. One thing that comes to mind actually as you're talking about it, the global publishers themselves. Obviously they have to adapt their material to suit the particular region, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it sort of depends. I think there's sort of 2 different ways about it again. One of them is custom publishing, which is where I have worked for the last 4 or 5 years. And then there is the more global generic publishing. And actually, if you're looking at the more global and generic one, there's not so much customization in it. It has to try to be a sort of a one-size-fits-all. The first publisher that I worked for, that I mentioned earlier, when I had those interviews and I got that first job, they were particularly focused on the Spanish market and Latin American markets. So a lot of it was based around Latin American and Spanish course curricular requirements from universities, education ministries. But equally, we knew that the book could be picked up in the Middle East, it could be picked up in Asia. So you also had to be mindful of sensitivities in different regions of the world and apply those, even though you may not even be targeting sales in those particular countries. There is a chance that somebody from those regions will pick it up and start to use it. So actually, it's not. I would say it's not really customized in that particular type of publishing. A lot of it is very generic, and many teachers will probably recognize the feeling of picking up a course book and kind of going, my students aren't going to relate to this. My students aren't going to connect to this. It doesn't touch on my students' experiences or how they live or their cultures. And that's because you are kind of keeping it very generic, so that it can be picked up all around the world, not offend people in different regions, and try to do the trick all over the place. So almost like you're jack of all trades, master of none. But then there is a part of publishing which is the customized publishing as well, and often that would be a university or an education ministry that says we want something specific for us, and then the publishers will develop that for them. So it's almost like a different arm of the publishing company, the customization.
And I suppose there is an argument for teachers themselves, because they know their students best, and for the materials that they use, the adaptation, the adaptability and customizing and supplementing what they've got with their course book to suit their students in a way.
Yeah, I mean, every teacher does it, and every teacher is encouraged to do that. And I think that is probably your kernel or the spark of the flame, in the sense that every teacher is in effect a materials developer or an editor of materials that they have, or they may take a theme or an idea from the course book and then find a real life example of a local news source that then you edit down. It might be above level for your students. If your students are, say, A2 or B1 level, then you know that you go back and you edit it down to the right level. That is that's kind of what we do sometimes in the publishing side of things. I did it myself. I used to go to Career Herald, Career News, find articles that were in English but about Korea that the Koreans are going to understand, the students are going to understand, rather than some articles that were, your faux realistic articles from the textbooks, and try to localize and try to bring the students' experiences into the classroom so they connect with the materials a little bit more. So that is definitely a plus point for somebody as a teacher has that skill to bring that into the particularly the customized part of publishing. Maybe perhaps not the more generic side of it, as I said, because one of the pieces of advice also that I was going to mention before we touched upon that was that you kind of have to, maybe in some ways you have to kind of drop the passion for or what you know about your local students for a generic product, because you can't necessarily bring everything that you do in your students or your classroom to a book that's got to hit the whole world and the whole market, because it might be very specific to them, and some things might be really specific to the culture of your students. So that's another thing. A lot of teachers approach publishers with, I've got this great book idea, it works so well in my classroom, it's brilliant, but it might only just be an audience of 30 students in your class. It may not translate to other people because you've hyper localized it to yourself. So that's another thing as well. One thing I learned was that you almost have to drop some things that you really like to do in your own classroom when you into publishing, and that's a bit of a learning curve sometimes.
Okay, all right. Now, in terms of publishing itself, there's a number of roles, particularly what you've mentioned on, customization and localization, editing the materials to best suit your students. But could you go through, when people say materials development, they automatically go into writing materials, but there's going to be a lot more to materials development in a way.
Yeah. I mean, when people hear the word editor, you automatically assume it's the person that sits there and, puts the commas in the right places or puts the dots on the I's and that sort of thing, which is a part of it. But then an editor then splits off into things like your copy editor and your content editor, which do different things. An editor in itself is a bit more like a project manager. So an editor is going to work with your author and give them the brief and keep them on schedule and give them some feedback while they're writing, take the work in, review it, pass it back, and then let other people know. So editorial also touches upon the photos and the artwork and the illustrations. It touches upon the page layouts of the book. And that's another thing I learned, that you can't stuff pages full of loads of things that you might do on a handout that you give to your students. You really have very limited space, and you really have to trim a lot of things down, and you have to be very mindful of how much you can produce. And you learn that very quickly by understanding how much would fit on one page of a Word manuscript that goes into design and things like that. So yeah, materials development isn't necessarily just the writing part of it. As you say, there's a lot more involved. There's the the artwork side. Again, coming back to the cultural sensitivities around the world, you have to be really careful of things like maps, for example, because you don't want to trigger the sensitivities between people in disputes.
Sure.
I do remember in Korea a few years ago when IKEA came along and they were selling a world map and it said Sea of Japan.
Yes. Okay.
Really upset by that and wanted it to be changed because they want to call it the EC, or they do call it the EC, and that can be that can be a very dangerous thing.
It can be quite contentious, of course.
Absolutely, yeah. And then lots of things towards the Middle Eastern sensibilities. You've got to be very careful if you have a picture of a restaurant scene, for example. You can't have a bottle of wine in the background somewhere. It might be that big, but you've got to be really careful and make sure that if it's a restaurant in Barcelona, you've got to make sure that you know what the Spanish words are saying on the blackboard or in the background. They might say something for the word for ham, for example, and somebody can in the Middle East would not like that. And materials development. Often, I think there's a kind of a template really for what you do, and you do have to stick with that framework mostly. Sometimes, what I said earlier about being adaptable to going to teaching career, for example, and understanding that there's certain ways you do things and almost let it wash over you. I think that applies to materials of development as well. Often you're writing to a brief, and so the publisher will want you to do certain things, and in some ways you're kind of a servant to the brief rather than this is my sort of big crafted work that I'm doing. Some people get a bit offended if you give them feedback because they felt they've crafted the perfect thing, but it perhaps isn't on the brief. So lots of different things to consider. But materials development isn't necessarily just the writing. It is lots of other things.
There was one project that I was involved with, very small, recently with one of the main publishers in the UK, and it was to do with adding a chapter to a book, and the publishers approached me to act as, I think they called it, a critical friend. So going through their particular chapter, critiquing or giving maybe my own personal feedback based on my own experiences, and adding in some comments and then sending it back. And I found that process actually quite interesting, just going through reading what someone had actually authored as it being a draft within that particular chapter. And I never realized until recently that is like one small cog in a big publishing wheel.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think every role is a cog in every. I think every small role has a part to play, and it is a cog that creates this big oiled machine. I mean, you mentioned some of the other roles earlier, and I've touched upon editorial and materials development. That splits off as to whether you're working as a freelancer or whether you're working in-house as well. And there's also a digital side of things as well. I'm referring to print what I was talking about earlier.
Yes,
the digital side of things as well that works differently, because if you're working on a digital activity, you really can't have, and this applies to what I said earlier as well about the print, you really cannot have kind of ambiguous exercise or ambiguous answers, particularly for digital, because it's got to be scored by the computer that says your answer is irrefutably right or wrong. You can't have that moment of saying, well, technically the student's correct with that answer. It's not what I wanted, but programmed to tell you if you type in the word, and because if you're doing conjunctions, that's the one true answer. You can't sort of say, well, you could say something different, a synonym, and technically you're right, because you're That's another thing to think about as well. I remember writing exams for my students and thinking, okay, everything's great, everything's solid, everything's watertight, and then I get to number 3, marking, and go, well, they're not wrong, well, I'll give them half a point maybe, and then 6 exam papers later you go, well, that one's done it as well, so if I've done it for this student, I've got to do it for that one. And then
yes,
you've got to keep that in mind as well.
Of course. Yeah. And so let's say freelancing. So if people are wanted to get involved within the field of publishing, what would be perhaps the first steps that someone could take as a freelancer in conjunction with their teaching responsibilities? What sort of things could they pursue?
Yeah, I think you maybe best off to start thinking about what it is that you want to actually do, is kind of research the roles that there are available and then decide what it is that you want to do, because not only within not only just the role, there's also, are you going to specialize in, say, primary? Are you a primary teacher and you only want to work on primary materials? Are you a teacher that straddles teaching primary or kindergarten and then teaches elementary in the afternoon in a Hagwan? And you could do both because you're familiar with those. And then you've got people that teach universities that maybe only want to focus on that particular genre. One really good way to start out is just looking at the landscape where you are. If you're in Korea, for example, there's several Korean publishers that publish English language materials. I was lucky enough to go to Korea last summer for the Seoul Book Fair for my job, and I went to Kyobo Bookstore in Gangnam and the one in Chongqing as well. And I went to all these English books. And first of all, I was looking for the ones that I worked on years ago, because they put your name on the inside cover.
Oh, yes.
And you go, yeah, my name in print, sort of thing. So I did that. But I also looked at sort of everything. And I took the details of all the publishers I could find that were working on similar books, took the email address and sort of wrote to them and things like that. So, there's that. And then also, I think deciding, do you want to be a writer? Do you want to be an editor? Do you want to be a proofreader? Which is different to the editorial. That's more of your drilling down on the style guides and things like that. So maybe having a look at the publishing landscape. Who are the publishers? What do they do? What do they publish? And think about what it is that you would like to do. You can also then start to follow things like their social media. You can go on their pages, their Instagram, etc., and get a bit more of a sense of what they do, and kind of get a bit of a familiarity with the landscape of publishing. But also then if you have been somebody that's working on your own materials for your classroom, supplementing things for your textbooks, you've probably got a backlog of materials that you've written or crafted. You can then start to create some samples of your own. Look at those. Here's a sample of my writing. Here's a sample of an article that I took from the newspaper, and I edited it down. I graded it too, and I created materials around it. Have a little portfolio sort of that way. I think it's really helpful to have something like that you can show to people. Sometimes proofreaders will just ask you to take a test to show what you can do. And another thing you can do is start to maybe connect with people on LinkedIn, for example, who are working in the industry, make a connection, ask for their advice, kind of see what they're posting about. A lot of editors post about what they're doing or things that they are working on, or they attend events. In Korea, for example, I think you've just had Kotesol, haven't you?
That's right, the Kotesol international conference that we had recently. Yeah.
So that's an opportunity to go and meet some publishers. I think they go there and have a stand, don't they? And you can have people, and some speculative emails. I mean, as I fell into teaching, I also fell into publishing. But somebody I knew was working at a publishing company. We connected, and she said, "Oh, we're working on a university course." And just like you were approached, Martin, you just said about reading a chapter and critiquing it. That's initially what we discussed, but in the end, that never came off. And I was persistent, and I kept emailing and saying, can we work together? And in the end, she turned around and said, well, that's not going ahead, but we need copy editors. So can you do that? So I went and kind of Googled, what is a copy editor? And I realized that a copy editor is essentially like a teacher that's marking an essay from a student. You're guiding them on the voice the author, you're guiding on the content, you're guiding on whether the structure works and things like that. So I just said, okay, I got a sample unit, and I did it, and they were happy with me, and gave me the whole book to do, and it's gone from there. So I think, there's several things you can do, and that probably takes 3 to 6 months. It's not going to happen overnight, but
Of course.
if you do a bit of research, follow people, connect with people, learn about what they do, look at what you do yourself, and connect what you've done as a teacher with the type of work that publishers do, find correlations, find transferable skills, and then you've got something you can say to them, this is what I do and this is what I can offer to you.
Yes. It's quite interesting because you mentioned a portfolio, having a portfolio material, and I remember a colleague that I used to work with in the UK, and he was very much into creating his own material, and he would share his own lesson plans and that sort of thing through his personal blog. He set up his own website, and at the time I had my own personal website, and I said to him, come on, you should create your own blog and you can share your own lessons, and etc. etc. After a little persuading, he managed to get registered and set up his website, and then he started developing his bank of material, which he shared, and his experiences of teaching, and and now he's more involved with publishing material for the EAL, English for Additional
English
purposes.
is an additional language.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, exactly.
EAP. There's lots of different.
Yes, a lot of different acronyms.
EAP, ASAP. Add words in and make longer acronyms. But, and that's something I didn't mention. But it's something I've never really done. But yes, people do that type of thing as well. They share their materials, or sometimes even sell them. But I think that what that does is show your authority, or show your ability. But I think one thing that maybe a lot of publishers work to a very tight schedule. They want people that they know can do something very quickly, follow a brief and not go off it. So if you can kind of demonstrate that you can do that, you're making the work lighter for everybody involved. So that's another thing as well. Kind of understanding that you have these materials, but you also can be helping publishers with what they need to do and helping to lighten the load for them. That's I think a key thing as well.
Yeah. Okay, and then we've spoken more about the freelance aspects, and in a moment I'd like to talk about maybe working full time as within materials development. But before we do, I'd like to just segue into our sponsor for today. So today, this show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational. They're publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. So level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com. To explore their range of titles. Use their code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your next order. Okay, so when it comes down to full-time employment, let's say for the global publishers or the local publishers, what sort of advice would you have, what advice would you have?
I think a bit like talking about Hagwan or university, there's different mindsets perhaps in the publishing house than there would be if you were to be a sort of a freelancer, and depends on the different publishing houses. Many of the big sort of leading publishing houses are quite traditional. There's a channel within them that you get into, and you kind of work in that channel. So if you work in editorial, for example, you will do editorial work, and you don't really cross over into materials development or perhaps digital side of things. My first role, I was an editor in that role, and so I was very much in that channel. I had worked freelance for 4 or 5 years with Korean publishers up to that point, where I had done some materials writing I had done proofreading. I also, touching back upon my previous point, I had done some other work with magazines in career, a Groove magazine that used to exist. I don't know if it's still around. I did some editorial work with them. I worked with Korean Airs magazine. I worked with some schools and some businesses to copy edit and proofread, and a translator. I did lots of different things. So I got used to being able to jump between different things. But when I went in-house, I was expected to do one role, and I was probably a little bit naive. I thought, well, if I can do that, I can grab some of the skills and progress into different areas. So I think in-house is a little bit more channeled. You're in a channel, and you can actually progress through the channels. You can go from an editor to a senior editor to a content editor and then a development editor, all have different kind of expectations on what they do, and then perhaps into the management roles. So there is a lot of progression in it, but I think it's very much a one flow channel. In the custom publishing side of things, it's very different. I mean, where I work, we specialize in custom publishing. I've done that for the last 4 or 5 years, and we work with universities and ministries who want bespoke things. And I mean, just in the last week, I've written lessons, I've done some proofreading, I've done some management, I'm briefing people, I'm doing lots of different things. So it can be different. It can be different on where you go. And I think you may also start a bit lower than maybe where you think you might be able to start. You know, you might be expected to prove yourself with a big picture. So you may start more at the bottom, and you've got to be open to that. You've got to be open to getting a foot and then moving up rungs, and be open with that. It's also not the most well-paid of industries, but then perhaps TEFL teaching isn't particularly well-paid either. It does take you into an industry. It gives you training and background and experiences that are then transferable sort of elsewhere. And so in-house is perhaps a little bit more channeled than it might be if you were freelance. Freelance, you've got the opportunity to work on several different things sometimes at the same time and do your teaching. So you'll be more varied.
Yes, I suppose that's true. And what would be, I suppose, experience is one thing when it comes down to working in-house, but what sort of skills or what sort of educational background are the publishers looking for?
I think all backgrounds and probably all skills as well. And teaching skills are almost very similar to what you do in editorial, because you are working with different people, you're working to deadlines, you're working with you can think about it a little bit like when you give your homework assignments out to the students, you're giving a brief to somebody who then goes and does the work. That would be your author or even your editor. If you're an editor project managing in-house and you give it to an editor to do the editorial work, it's almost like the back and forth between the teaching and that. So your time management, ability to stick to schedules, adaptability and flexibility, also key skills, but also, you know, your knowledge of the language, your knowledge of how things, you know, how you should construct sentences and how to write good materials with good answers, sticking to briefs. All of those things kind of come out from teaching, but the pedagogical knowledge you have as a teacher is really important as well, because you may, if you take an editorial role, for example, you may work with somebody who is an author who hasn't been in the classroom for 25 or 30 years, and they might be writing something, and you have that sixth sense that that's not going to work in a classroom, and you can advise on how things would change, also how you can change that and sculpt that. So that's where the materials development side kind of bleeds into editorial as well. Or you may be the author, and then you'll have somebody feeding back to you as well. So I think there's tons of different skills that all kind of merge together to help. It's a very hard question to answer, but as a teacher, you know, you do have that knowledge of the classroom, and you do know how students work and what materials work well as well. So there's lots of different things you can bring in.
I see. Yeah. I suppose when it comes down to teaching itself, it's such a broad industry, because as you mentioned about the acronyms, there's a number of different acronyms and a number of different specializations. And I guess the same could be said about materials development, writing, editing, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it'll go. You go through 2, 3, 4 drafts sometimes of manuscripts. You may turn something in and be expected to do something completely different. Go back and revise it. Just like we mentioned earlier about your lessons. You have your first lesson, which is like your first draft, then you go back and tweak it based upon feedback or whether it's worked or not, or even sometimes you may publish something and the market just says there's maybe some problems, so you go back for your second edition of the book, and then you revise to a third edition of the book, and you take on that feedback from teachers and marketing, and some publishers also are looking for people that can do teacher training. So I've done a little bit of myself as well. So you're there talking. As a teacher, you're talking to teachers and helping them learn how they can teach this book as well. So there's also, we didn't really sort of mention that or touch upon that, but there's also teacher trainer positions as well that publishers are looking for.
Oh, of course.
And do the training of the book.
I suppose, sorry to interject, but one of the directors that I worked with in the UK, he'd actually contributed towards the teacher's book for a course book. So there's that side of things. So having to write how to teach a particular chapter or things to consider, supplementary things. As well.
I've done that myself sometimes. I mean, sometimes I've worked only on a teacher's book, and I've written things, and I think back to my days of teaching kindergarten, and you think of the little warm-up activities you used to do, and you can put that in. So your experience as being a teacher, you can put in things that you do for your class, and there's so many little games or activities or things that I used to do that I've added as a quick warm-up or an introduction, or sometimes you might be revising a book from a second or a third edition, and you might, if you're a development editor or a materials developer, you're going to develop what you've got and add little bits in. You can bring your own experience into that sometimes as well and add things in. I mean, you collaborate with an editor, the editor might then sort of say, oh, we don't want that, and cut it out. But there's things that you can bring from your experience in your classroom into the materials that you're working on.
Of course.
I probably haven't mentioned, but yes, it's very collaborative as well. You are collaborating with somebody at all times. You're collaborating with an editor who's doing the work, or you're an editor that's collaborated with the author, and not always a solitary experience. You may be doing the work yourself solitarily, but you are often in collaboration with somebody who's overseeing the project as well.
Yes, that's true. It's not so, not well. I suppose quite. What's the word? Working in a remote environment, you're by yourself, but you're part of a bigger component.
People are there, and people are there to help you. It's not just a case of like go off and do it, and then you've got no one to turn to. You often and often you're in collaboration, because, as I said, you'll be working on one thing and you pass it to an editor who's going to feed back, and it comes back to you, and you work on things, and then you can discuss what the whys and wherefores and things like that.
And I suppose my final question now, probably slightly broad, in terms of materials, the industry, from my own experience, has kind of evolved, where it was more physical course books. We've now had the generation with tablets and post-COVID with online material. Where do you see things progress in terms of material for online teaching, for that environment of teaching?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's one of the, when I was in Korea, and I don't know if it's your experience now, but the students never came with tablets or computers into the classroom. They often had their printed course book, and they had their notebooks, and everything was done that way. It was very few students that would have a tablet or laptop or even use it in the classroom, versus perhaps maybe in the Western world, people, you see films where lecture halls are full of students on laptops taking their notes. And so I don't know, because I left teaching the week of 2020 where we went into lockdown in the UK, and that's because I was switching jobs and wasn't able to teach in the evenings anymore. And I've never really done online teaching,
Mm.
but I know that it hugely changed the way that teachers were teaching. One of the things I talked about in my job interview when I was changing that job that time was, where did I see the future of digital? And I felt that it had kind of splintered. There were so many publishers having their own LMS or learning management system, that teachers are having to take a new course book and learn a new system, and they didn't want to. They just weren't really bothering with it. And then suddenly they had to be online and they had to be doing that. So I think the industry really swerved and went, right, everything's got to be digital. And now it's settling a bit where it's, I don't know what your experience is in the classroom.
Yeah. Well,
but I think it's going back a bit.
It's interesting to see the progression into the online teaching sphere. My experience actually, I think it was about 10 years ago or so, about 2015, possibly 2014. And at that time, I just started teaching online to a range of students based in China. And I was working through an agency. They had their own materials and their own, students, and that was all good. And I went for I gave like a training workshop in Germany, and there were some other prominent ELT experts, and I asked them, why is online teaching not really being taught for initial teacher training? And they said, well, it's not really considered a professional. It's just, it's not recognized as an outlet for teaching. It's just something that people do in their free time, regardless of their experience or qualifications. And then, about 5 years later, the pandemic hit and everybody switched over to online teaching. And unfortunately for me, I was very lucky to have gained that experience, 5 years experience leading up to the pandemic. So I didn't feel too uncomfortable about delivering courses, but I did feel for my colleagues who were unaware or didn't have any experience at all, because
so they were caught aware of it all.
Like rabbit in headlights, I suppose.
Right.
And sorry, and to finalize, I guess my recent experience in the UK was that there was a course book which was online, available through a digital bookshop, and then the students managed to get an extract from that, and then we developed the lessons through that. And then my experience now in Korea, although it's 90% face-to-face, the students do bring in their laptops, their tablets, their mobile phones, their smart devices.
All the students had a phone when I was teaching there, but they never. And I started to kind of utilize the phone a bit. A lot of the students were sort of, often obviously texting and that kind of thing. But if you could throw them an activity where they could do something with their phone, bring the power of that in. Teaching synonyms and antonyms, for example, I would teach them a lesson about using the thesaurus. So I'd get them doing that, and they'd use it for their phone, see how that could help them. But I think the industry swerved towards it. I think we're scaling back a little bit. AI, of course, is a whole other conversation, but AI is circling around, and everyone's kind of trying to figure out how that will fold into what we do and where it will take us. That's probably a whole other conversation. So,
especially in the ELT publishing industry, I guess it's quite a big element to consider as well.
Yeah, I think the consensus at the moment tends to be that it's going to be useful for automating some of the more tedious processes, but you will still need to have humans involved in it. And obviously, there's whole things about copyright. If you can't just generate AI materials, and because who owns it and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of, that's kind of it in a nutshell. I think a lot of people are coming around to the fact that it will be very helpful used in the right way, but you probably won't get rid of too many human elements, because we're still needed to check things and make sure that things are appropriate.
One thing to mention, actually, when I first started working in South Korea at the university, I remember printing out my handouts and bringing them in, that I had them carrying them, they're probably with 40 students in the class about thick, and
I do the same.
I would hand them out. And then one student came up to me and said, why don't you just save on the photocopying and just give us the material available online? And then I thought to myself, why don't I do that? Since then I've ended up sharing worksheets and what have you on the LMS, on the
I went through a period of trying to use something like Schoology, I think it was called, or a particular LMS, but then just found that the easiest thing to do was to learn the Korean, to use the school's LMS system and let the students use what they knew, because they were getting confused by having to go to the English language side and work it all out. I was getting so much trouble from it, and I just thought the easiest thing is, I'd learned Korean and I took the TOEIC test, so I just thought I'll just use the LMS and that's easier for them, easier for all involved, and do it that way. But that's kind of where I got to, where I was sharing materials online and with using the LMS and having them submit materials to me. Didn't really use too much of the online things from the book, but then a course book with 120 hours versus a semester of 16 weeks of 3 hours a week, 48 hours. You're picking things out anyway, and it wasn't really time for that. As I say, I think it did shift massively, and then it's scaling back, and it's to be seen, isn't it, how it will all pan out. I think there's a kind of a nice hybrid at the moment.
Yes, I think so. Well, are there any final things that you'd like to say, or because we'll finish off shortly?
Yeah, no, I mean, good luck to anybody that's actually going to make this move and is looking to do it. It's very rewarding, and I'm quite happy to answer anybody's questions if they want to get in touch somehow. I think my details have been shared by the Teach Talk Radio, or certainly my name is out there. You can find me, and I'm happy to answer questions for people. I hope I've been able to answer some of those questions. Some of the things I've touched upon could have been developed a little bit more, but we've gone into other things. But if you're thinking of if you're thinking that you might not ever be a teacher for the rest of your life and you want something else to do, it's a really worthy and really interesting path to go down. And I wish anybody luck in that field if they're going in it. But if anybody does want to get in touch with me later on, then they can look me up I'm on LinkedIn. They can look me up and find me, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Well, thank you ever so much for agreeing to be part of this episode. And
great.
It'd be great to have you back.
I'd love to be back if I can. Yeah, if you want me back in some way, I'd love to. We can discuss if there's anything else I can talk about with you.
Sure. All right. Well, that's it for today's live stream. A huge thanks to everyone who has joined. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to add in the comments or mention on the various sites it's been shared at. And we'll be keen to answer any queries that anyone has. Thank you.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused